So here's the thing. The other day I was planning my live streams, right? So I'm streaming today, I'm streaming again on Saturday, and I noticed the date. Saturday is 9/11. 20 years later. Oh my god, did that get me thinking. That's 2 decades from a day in the life that I think anyone who was around with living memory will remember where they were, and it gives you a moment to like reflect on what's happened over those 20 years, right? I kind of remember vaguely the 10-year anniversary coming around. Maybe this is one of those things where it's like, you remember the main event, but maybe not so much like anniversaries, but like they are times of reflection. So I'd seen that there were like documentaries on Netflix, and I was kind of like, I'd lived through 9/11. And I say that, we lived through that era, not that I was there or anything. And, I know all of this inside out. But then when I realised that, oh my god, it's 20 years, then all of a sudden my brain ticked over and I was like watching these documentaries, sort of almost like reliving it again and remembering it. I was unborn, says Purpura. Well, I was a young teenager at school. Here's the story, my story. I was looking at the times when watching the documentaries on like when the towers were hit, and I did a little math and I thought, yeah, it probably was the last class of our day. So like 2 to 3 was the last class of our day, and due to the 5-hour difference, it would have been a little bit into that class that the towers would have been hit. And what I remember is our teacher wasn't there. Something was going on. Like you could just sort of tell because everyone was in classrooms, but teachers weren't, and they were sort of like walking about. And then the teacher just came in and sort of went, right, we're going to send everyone home and go and watch the TV, and you will find out like what's happening and why you've been sent home. Which, on reflection, you could open that up to anything really. Like that could have set off some panic. That's how I remember it going down. Maybe it wasn't quite like that. Maybe they explained that we were safe and it was fine, but we're just going to send everyone home. So I went home. God, I remember the living room, right? Like old school 90s noughties furniture, big old white. It was a widescreen TV, but it was one of those CRT type monitors with like the big vacuum on the back of it, and it was quite a big telly. It was grey around the outside, and I used to watch MTV and Limp Bizkit on it and stuff like that back in the day. Oh god. And yeah, just sat like glued to the television, just being a bit too young to really like comprehend what I was watching. And it was like my first introduction to the term terrorism and the concept of people out there that want to do evil things or whatever. Thinking back on it, I think I was just like too young to really like comprehend it properly. And so it just kind of became this weird event that happened. And I remember the following years was like the news cycle on it was crazy. And obviously there was like war unfolding, the war on terror. And all of a sudden you knew about Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Afghanistan, all this new language and places and people, Osama bin Laden, and it was quite a heavy time. But over here in the UK, I remember the general consensus, as it were. Now, being a young person not exposed to a lot of media or people with different opinions, it's hard to say, but it kind of felt like the country didn't want to go to war over this. And there were huge rallies against sending troops over to Afghanistan and whatnot over here. And so after the event happened, the narrative very much turned to being about war for oil and being against going over there, which is something I don't really hold myself to anymore. Back then I would have been all like, oh yeah, it's all about, getting in there and getting the oil and controlling that, and right, I know how it really works. All this terror stuff, that's just a guise. Whereas you don't know what you don't know, okay? To have an opinion on such a big and complex topic as to why war is taking place and the reasons for it, you tend to forget how little you might know about how those things work. And so where I've grown up over time and spent time investigating or listening to podcasts with people who were actually, inside the American government at the time those things were happening, I realized that there's just so much I don't know about how the world operates and functions. So why am I so drawn towards an idea like that? And I think it's just because it's so simplistic. It's so simplistic to think of things in terms of good and evil, right? So it's like, big evil government going to war for oil. It's just kind of a simple thing to understand, but then all of the levers that would have to be pulled for that to be true and for something like 9/11 to be not as it seems is just a bit much. So after that happened, after 9/11 happened, and then there was like this kickback in Europe and the UK against the war, a few years later, then the idea of the inside job kind of surfaced. I reckoned it was around like 2003, 2004, maybe even 2005, that this idea surfaced that it was an inside job. At least to me. I don't know when that discussion first started, but I got pulled into it through watching documentaries that were distributed through torrent websites. So this would be the equivalent of like today passing around a video on YouTube, right? That's all about conspiracy or whatever. And being quite young and naive, it like really roped me in, and I kind of just went along with these documentaries, air quotes, about it being an inside job. And it's a lesson to learn looking back on it, because I was really convinced at the time it was an inside job. But the reason I was is because I was watching these documentaries where it's just a running narrative leading you down a path, showing you all the things to support the conclusions that it's trying to present to you. And there's not a lot of room for playing devil's advocate or skepticism or bringing on people with differing opinions. And that's something really important to do with all information and opinions you have, is seek out other ideas, right? Because without them, it's very easy just to be led down a narrative. We tend to not be skeptical or to play devil's advocate, right? It tends to be a thing that you kind of have to learn to do and prompt yourself to do. I'm hearing a narrative here, right? I need to remind myself, what could be different about this? What do I not know about this? Is there another way of seeing this information that's being shared with me, right? What are we discussing, says Hyped Geek? We're discussing 9/11 and some of the conspiracy stuff that dropped out after it. And then it wasn't until a long time later that I really had to like reassess my opinion on it being an inside job. And that came about from me doing streaming here on YouTube. And by having an audience listen, it made me kind of realize, maybe not in one instance, but over time, that you have to think about what you say a lot more, because there's a lot of people listening. And it's all right to sort of chat rubbish and muck about with mates, but when you're talking to a bunch of strangers online, some people might be taking what you're saying, as truth. And with my interest in ignorance and how the brain can kind of trick you in the human experience, I then start to realize, what do I actually know about this stuff, right? Start to measure one's own ignorance and realize that actually there's a lot of stuff that's knowable out there, and I don't know a lot of it at all. And so then, when the topic of like 9/11 comes around again, I realised that I no longer believe it's an inside job. Totally don't. The biggest point of logic I could refer to is just that it's such a big thing for it to be an inside job, right? It's such a massive thing to pull off. If it were, there would either be like a trail of bodies or people talking about it by now. And maybe one day there might, maybe the narrative might turn. That's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, is we're going through a pandemic. Things are very divisive. In the future, when the dust settles, historians will look back on things, and those that try and do a diligent job and, aren't trying to insert their own ideology or political agenda, they might tell a very different story about what we're currently going through. But when you're in it, it feels very different from how it might be seen historically. And I guess a little bit of that is now in the 9/11 thing. The more that time goes by, to me it feels like the conspiracy stuff has really died down. Jay Nix says, what's an inside job? The inside job is the idea that it was people inside of the government, I don't know what people or what levels, are supposedly orchestrating this event in some manner. Whether that means they knew it was going to happen and they decided not to act on it so that they could use it to pass acts like the Patriot Act. That's the sort of conspiratorial thinking, and that's what an inside job would be if it turned out to be true. One thing to point out though is that like a conspiracy, these things do happen. People do conspire, and conspiracies have been proven. So I'm not trying to conflate the idea of conspiracy theory just being a quack thing. Sometimes it needs to be taken legitimately. In this case, I don't think so anymore. MC Crimson King says 100% inside, and 99% of people who think don't remember 3 towers fell. Right. I would encourage you to seek out the reasons as to why a 3rd tower fell. I don't remember specifically, but I know there's things that I'd seen at the time that later on got explained by different sources, because I watched these conspiratorial videos and they run you down a narrative and they talk to experts, which is always great, right? Here's the thing, you can kind of find an expert with any opinion. It's absolutely crazy. Again, to take in the pandemic and some of the current issues we have with certain medical things that are going on, if you actually pay attention to what both sides are saying, they're both capable of finding people who are supposedly experts with contradictory opinions. Truth is a very difficult and complicated thing, and too often people insert their own ideas into it, and you know, you can find people with opinions on all sides. Now, one of the things that started to break down my belief in it before I started streaming was talking to a friend who understood how air traffic control worked and explained that what they had said in the documentary was really not how it worked at all. In the documentary, they said they were talking to an expert, you know? So remember, like, this isn't me trying to say wrong or right. I'm trying to walk you through my reasoning, because the reality is all this information that we get in our lives, things we think are true or not, so much of it just is handed down person to person. We tend to learn a lot of stuff just because someone else told us this was it, you know? This is how it works. And if you think about that, yeah, we actually need that, you know. If we had to go back to square one to prove absolutely everything every single time it came up, you know, like GPS. Imagine trying to explain GPS and going back to square one. Like, it would be insane. So we have to kind of trust one another. All right, this is how GPS works. There's satellites up there, right, and they're orbiting, and you know, we ping them with our phone, and then we know where we are on the planet. Got ya, cool. Not going down to like, oh, this is how orbital mechanics works, and this is the science of sending a rocket into space, and here's the evidence of us sending it up, right? Like, we have to rely on that. We have to rely on listening to other people. So to say about the three towers, right, go seek out the alternative information as well. Don't be like trapped into just listening to one side of it, and don't let one thing be the linchpin as well. That being said, the thing that is the linchpin for me, I guess, if I'm using that word correctly, is the inside job idea, and like, it kind of feels like this would have been a big inside job to pull off. Surely people would have come out and talked about it by now, or if it were an inside job, surely there would have been other people in judiciary systems who would have exposed this corruption by now. It just seems like such a... Like, when something is that big to cover up, there's got to be a trail of coercion, deceit, or bodies or something, and it doesn't seem to be any of that. It doesn't seem to be any of that. Anyway, I wanted to run a poll, so... Okay, so this is the question. Do you think it was an inside job? Certain? Probably? Don't know. In the middle? Probably not. Definitely not. You get the rough idea. You got 5 choices. Now, I don't want to make this political. I don't want to make it an argument. You're entitled to have your opinion. Let's be respectful of one another here. The reason I'm doing this is just to get a sense of, has this changed? And, you know, me conducting a small poll with my audience is no test or real measure of what the majority of people say. However, when I was younger and talking about this stuff, it kind of seemed like a lot of people were gravitating to the idea of it. Or maybe it was like because I'm talking about it and the people that want to talk about it as well are also believing in it. You know, you get kind of in that echo chamber. You end up talking to other people who believe the same as you. But it certainly seemed like at the time it was kind of a big thing. Like, a lot of people were believing it was an inside job. So it'd be interesting just to see what all of y'all think now. JG says this is dumb. Would you like to shed light on why you believe this is dumb? or do you mean just believing it was an inside job is dumb? This is so messed up, please. This is such a horrible thing to believe, says Evermari. Like I said, let's try and just be a little bit respectful and not paint the worst of each other here, because if it turned out to be true, then all of a sudden what you were saying would become very different. Now, that's not an argument to say that it is true, but sometimes history does change later on when certain facts come to life. I don't think it's going to change. It seems like with time, to me, I hear less and less about that idea. If it had more credibility and weight, you'd kind of expect that to ramp up with time, as opposed to just fizzle out. I don't know. I certainly no longer subscribe to that idea at all. And I remember, like, some of the arguments, like, hinged around George W. Bush and how he reacted to it, right? People were saying, look, they tell him in the classroom and he just sits there. He knows it's an inside job and all this, right? And that kind of reasoning is pretty silly, because, like, you know, what exactly was said to him, and how would a person deal with that? I know he's the president, but, like, he's also a human being. Imagine if someone came up to you and said, I don't know, some buildings near you have been hit by a plane. Like, the gravity of learning that. I would not be surprised if I sat in shock for a few minutes before figuring out what on earth I've got to do. Maybe a better president might have jumped straight into action, but it's not a reason to say that he was in on it. I just don't believe that. speaking of what happened after it, America was very hurt and quick to go out for vengeance. And that is something I think has really hurt it ever since. Hurt the American image. Look at what happened in Afghanistan and ISIS and what it all led to. There's this quote, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And I think this is like one of those moments in history where you can say the sort of quick and rash response was very much going to hurt them again at some point, right? And that's not a judgment on American values or anything like that. I say it with respect. I just think looking back at it, you can see why people are upset and angry. That's very obvious, and that, of course, it's human and emotional to want to do something in response, but like sometimes we need to override our emotions and realize that they can lead us into actions and places that we actually don't want to go. And of all the politicians in Congress that I think, they then went and voted on some sort of war act to go to war against terror in Afghanistan. Only one politician stood up against that, and they received a lot of abuse as a result of this. Which is, again, I can understand why they would receive that. I don't think it's right to abuse people in that way, but very emotional time. I mean, oh god, the images from 9/11, like the one that chokes me up is when you see people like just jumping off the building. That brings me to tears every time. Like, just the magnitude of that situation where they know this is it and they choose to jump. That's some gravity right there. Just, god, it's difficult to watch that stuff. Very difficult. Yes, that famous photograph of the falling man. That's haunting, says Darth and Eilish. Yep. Yes, it is. Let's have a look. Most of you say probably not with 43%. 29 say definitely not. 17% don't know. Probably at 8 and certain at 3%. So interesting to see. I think that's good. The most of you think probably not. I personally just think, I don't know. Yes, conspiracies can actually be true, but doesn't seem like it to me. And as time goes on, it feels like there's less anger and outrage around that idea, and it's just one of those things that's become less prominent.